Why does one room in the house stay colder, even when the heat is on? That was the first question Sarah asked the realtor, laughing nervously as her husband, Tom, brushed his hand along the doorframe of the upstairs bedroom. They'd only been in the house for 10 minutes, and already, Sarah felt the wrongness clinging to that room like mildew on old wallpaper. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel in your bones after a snowy walk. It was sharper, more deliberate. A cold that seemed to reach for you. The realtor smiled too quickly. Old houses have drafts, she said. It's nothing. Probably the insulation. But Sarah wasn't convinced. The rest of the house, an early 1900s colonial with a wraparound porch and gabled roof, was warm, even stuffy from the late autumn sun. Yet when she stepped into the upstairs room, the air felt brittle, as though it could shatter if she breathed too hard. Tom, practical as ever, rolled his eyes. If insulation is the only problem, then we're lucky, he said. This is the kind of place people dream of finding. And he was right. The price was impossibly low. The location, a sleepy Massachusetts town tucked between woods and a narrow river, was exactly what they wanted. A good school for their daughter Emily. A yard big enough for a swing set. Neighbors far enough away to give space but close enough to wave. It was too good to pass up. So despite the cold, despite Sarah's instincts whispering no, they signed the papers within the week. The move-in went smoothly. The furniture arrived, boxes were unpacked, and Sarah tried to ignore the way Emily avoided the upstairs room altogether. It smells funny in there, the 7-year-old muttered one night at dinner, stabbing her macaroni with unusual seriousness. Tom chuckled. That's because the room hasn't been lived in for a while. Give it time, kiddo. But Sarah noticed Emily's refusal to even look at the doorway when they passed it in the hall. She noticed how the cat, Whiskers, hissed when Sarah tried to set his bed near the cold room. She noticed the shadows in the corners of that room seemed to linger long after the sun had gone down, clinging to the walls like stains. One afternoon, Sarah tried to clean it. She opened the blinds wide, set down a bucket of warm water, and started scrubbing the baseboards. But the moment she dipped her rag into the water, she froze. The water was steaming. Not because it was hot, but because the air was so cold it made warmth impossible to ignore. She pressed her hand against the hardwood floor, and the wood bit back like ice. By the time she left the room, her fingers were stiff and aching, as though she'd been outside in January without gloves. Tom dismissed it all. Drafts, he kept saying. Old houses always have quirks. That's why we got it so cheap. But the quirks began to grow. Sarah started finding spoiled food in the fridge, though she'd only bought it a day earlier. Milk soured overnight. Bread molded within hours of opening. When she pulled the trash outside, raccoons avoided it, as though the rot was something even they wouldn't touch. And always, the cold room seemed to hum. Not with sound, no, that would have been easier to explain. It was a vibration she felt in her teeth, in her bones, like the faint buzz of electricity running through the air. She never kept the door open, but sometimes in the mornings, it was ajar anyway. On the third week, Sarah woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of Emily's voice. At first, she thought her daughter was sleep-talking. But when she crept into the hall, she realized the voice wasn't coming from Emily's room. It was coming from the cold room. Her breath fogged instantly as she approached the door. She tried to steady herself, hand shaking as she reached for the knob. It was like gripping a block of ice. She whispered, pushing the door open an inch. The room was darker than it should have been. The street light outside the window didn't reach in, as though swallowed by the walls themselves. Mommy? Emily's voice echoed faintly, not from within the room, but from the far corner, beneath the floorboards. Sarah's skin crawled. She slammed the door shut so fast the frame rattled. When she hurried to Emily's actual bedroom, she found her daughter sound asleep, tucked beneath her blankets, breathing evenly. Sarah didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By the fourth week, Tom had to admit something was wrong. They'd hosted a small dinner party, neighbors, trying to be friendly. Everyone avoided the cold room, even without being told. Conversation was lively until Sarah set a bowl of fresh strawberries on the table. Within minutes, the fruit collapsed into gray mush, oozing liquid that smelled like rot. The neighbors left quickly, faces tight, polite goodbyes masking discomfort. Tom stared at the mess, silent for once. He didn't laugh it off. Didn't call it insulation. Maybe there's mold, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah leaned closer, lowering her voice so Emily, playing upstairs, wouldn't hear. It's not mold, Tom. It's that room. He looked up, eyes troubled. For the first time, he didn't argue. That night, Sarah woke again to a sound. Not Emily's voice this time, but a scraping. A dragging, like nails pulling across wood. From the cold room. Tom was asleep beside her, snoring softly. Sarah clutched the blanket, heart racing. The scraping grew louder. Longer. As though something were crawling across the floor, searching. And then, 3 deliberate knocks rattled the bedroom wall. The wall that backed up to the cold room. Knock. 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 Her breath caught in her throat. And slowly, the doorknob to their bedroom began to turn. Sarah couldn't move. Her body was rigid, frozen in place beneath the heavy blankets, her mind screaming at her to shake Tom awake, but her throat felt locked shut as though something pressed against it from the inside. She watched, wide-eyed, as the bedroom doorknob rattled softly at first, then turned with slow, deliberate force. The metallic click of the latch carried across the room, far too loud in the silence. The door creaked open by an inch, then another, spilling nothing but darkness into the room. The hall light had been left on, Sarah was sure of it, but beyond the cracked door there was only a yawning void, thick and black as tar. Her first instinct was to look at Emily's door across the hall, but she couldn't see it. The light that should have stretched to her daughter's room had vanished as though the cold room's shadow swallowed it whole. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. She opened her mouth to call for Tom, but the sound stuck, catching halfway in her throat like a swallowed stone. The doorknob stopped turning. For one stretched out, agonizing moment, it held still. Then came the sound that shattered her composure completely, a faint whisper, low and dry, curling through the crack in the door. It wasn't Emily's voice. It wasn't even a voice she could recognize. It was older, rasping, and yet strangely hollow, as though it echoed from a long corridor beneath the floor. She could only make out 3 words, drawn out slowly, painfully. It's so cold. Sarah bolted upright and clutched Tom's arm with enough force to leave marks. He startled awake, confused, mumbling, What's wrong? But the moment his gaze followed hers to the half-open door, the confusion drained from his face. He sat up fast, swung his legs out of bed, and crossed the room in a few strides. The door slammed shut with a sharp crack that reverberated through the walls. He locked it with shaking fingers and pressed his back against it as though something might push its way in. For several long minutes, they just sat there, listening. The whispers were gone, the scraping had stopped, and the house was silent once more. Only the cold lingered, seeping through the wall like invisible fog, settling over their bed until Sarah shivered beneath the covers. Tom wouldn't admit it out loud, but Sarah could see the truth in his eyes. He was frightened. The next morning, Tom insisted on checking the room in the daylight. Sarah refused to go with him, but she lingered in the hallway as he opened the door, half expecting the same suffocating darkness from the night before. Instead, the cold room looked almost normal in the sunlight, dusty hardwood floor, peeling wallpaper near the window, a faint draft stirring the old curtains. Almost normal, but not quite. The air that poured out into the hall was still bitterly frigid, as if the space inside belonged to another season entirely. Tom knelt and knocked against the wall that backed up to their bedroom. Nothing hollow, he muttered, listening. Just old wood. He checked the vent, convinced that maybe the heating system wasn't reaching the room. But when he opened the grate, no air came out, no warmth, no draft. Just silence, heavy and absolute. He closed it quickly, jaw tightening. Sarah noticed something else. A small patch of floorboards near the far corner looked darker than the rest, as if wet. She She pointed it out, but when Tom pressed his hand against it, his palm recoiled instantly. "Jesus," he hissed, shaking his hand, his face pale. "That's freezing." It hadn't been water, it was frost. Thin, spiderwebbing cracks of ice clung to the boards in delicate veins, even though the house was heated and the day outside was mild. Tom didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was hushed. "We'll keep this door shut. Until we figure something out." But Sarah heard what he didn't say. He didn't say it's nothing anymore. That night, Sarah dreamed of the room. She stood in the center of it, barefoot, her nightgown clinging to her skin as her breath hung in the air like smoke. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching and pulling until they resembled figures, tall, faceless silhouettes that leaned forward as though curious. In the dream, Sarah felt no fear. Only a terrible, hollow sadness, as though something in the room mourned her presence. She woke with tears on her face and a heaviness in her chest she couldn't explain. Emily, however, wasn't merely dreaming. The child grew quieter in the days that followed, her usual chatter fading into silence. She no longer played with her dolls in the living room but instead sat near the stairs, staring up at the second floor. Sarah caught her whispering to someone when she thought no one was listening. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" Sarah asked gently. Emily blinked as though caught off guard. Then she smiled, small and tight. "The girl in the cold room." Sarah's blood chilled. "What girl?" Emily shrugged. "She says she used to live here. She doesn't like being alone." Sarah tried not to panic, tried to laugh it off, but Emily's eyes were serious, far older than they should have been. "She says we shouldn't shut the door at night," the girl added softly. "She says it makes her sad." Sarah grabbed her daughter's hand too quickly, too tightly. "Emily, listen to me. Don't talk to anyone in that room. Do you understand?" Emily frowned. "But Mommy, she already talks to me." 2 days later, Sarah was pulling laundry from the dryer when the smell hit her. Acrid. Sweet. Rotten. She gagged, covering her nose. The clothes she had just washed and dried were covered in mildew, black and slick, as though they had been sitting in a swamp for years. The stench clung to her hands, her hair, the air itself. She dumped the entire load outside, her stomach twisting. That evening, Tom brought home space heaters, determined to blast warmth into the cold room. He set them up, plugged them in, and shut the door. For hours, the machines hummed, rattling against the silence. But when he opened the door at midnight, every single heater was dead, melted wires, cracked plastic, as though they had been running for years instead of hours. And still, the room was freezing. The breaking point came 3 nights later. Sarah awoke not to whispers, not to scraping, but to the sound of crying. Soft, pitiful sobs drifting through the wall. It wasn't Emily, she checked, rushing to her daughter's room only to find her asleep, her tiny body curled beneath a blanket. No, the sound was coming from the cold room. Against her better judgment, Sarah crept down the hall and pressed her ear to the door. The crying was unmistakable, young and female, raw with despair. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes dissolving into frantic whispers she couldn't quite make out. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. This time, she meant to open it, meant to face whatever was inside. But just before she turned the handle, the sobbing stopped. A silence deeper than anything she had ever known pressed against the wood. Then, in a voice so close it could have been on the other side of the door, came a whisper. "Let me in." The knob turned under her palm before she could pull away. Sarah yanked her hand away from the doorknob as though it had burned her, stumbling back down the hall, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. She could still feel the cold of the metal biting into her skin, but worse than that, she could feel resistance, the undeniable sensation that something on the other side had been gripping it too, twisting against her, trying to come through. She staggered to her bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it, pressing her body against the wood as though that alone could keep her safe. Tom stirred groggily, rubbing his eyes, but when he saw Sarah trembling in the dark, her hands clutching at her own arms like she was holding herself together, he sat up fast. "What happened?" he asked, his voice urgent but hushed. She told him everything, the crying, the voice, the words she'd heard whispered. "Let me in." She expected him to argue, to scoff, to reduce it again to drafts and stress. But Tom just sat there, pale and silent, his jaw tight. When she finished, he looked toward the hallway, his face unreadable. "I'll board it up," he said finally. "First thing tomorrow." True to his word, Tom spent the next morning hammering plywood across the cold room's door. The sound of nails biting into the frame echoed through the halls, sharp and angry, as though the house itself resented the intrusion. Emily covered her ears, wincing with each strike of the hammer. Sarah lingered in the hall, arms folded, fighting a gnawing unease. When Tom stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead, the door was sealed tight. No knob, no entry, just a sheet of raw wood hammered flush against the frame. For the first time since moving in, Sarah felt a sliver of relief. The house seemed quieter, almost subdued, as if something had been contained. But the relief was short-lived. That night, Sarah awoke to the sound of hammering. Not the memory of it, real hammering, deliberate and rhythmic, echoing from the upstairs hall. Her chest tightened as she realized the sound was coming from the cold room. Bang. 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 She sat frozen in bed, listening, each strike reverberating through the walls as if someone, or something, was prying from the inside. The noise continued for hours, until just before dawn, when it ceased as suddenly as it had begun. When Tom checked the door the next morning, the plywood was intact, every nail in place. Yet Sarah swore she could see faint dents in the wood, as if pressed from within. Emily grew stranger with each passing day. She no longer spoke of the girl directly, but her drawings told a different story. Sarah found them scattered on the floor of Emily's room, crude crayon sketches of the upstairs hallway, the cold room door, and dark figures looming behind it. In every drawing, the figures reached toward a smaller shape, a child with pigtails. When Sarah asked about them, Emily shrugged, her voice soft. "She wants me to come play. She says it's warmer on her side." Sarah's stomach turned. "What do you mean warmer?" Emily didn't answer. She only smiled faintly, as though she knew something her mother didn't, and went back to coloring in silence. By the end of the 5th week, Sarah began to notice changes in the house itself. The once cozy rooms felt heavier, shadows stretching longer across the walls as if dusk lingered unnaturally. The smell of rot spread beyond the kitchen now, faint but ever-present, like soil mixed with something sour. She caught glimpses of movement in her periphery, a flicker of black in the mirror, the sway of a curtain when the windows were closed, a figure at the top of the stairs that vanished when she blinked. But the worst came on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was folding laundry in the living room when she heard Emily giggling upstairs. Relieved to hear her daughter laughing again, she started up the stairs to join her. But halfway up, her blood froze. The giggles weren't coming from Emily's room. They were muffled, distorted, leaking through the plywood boards sealing the cold room. The laugh was Emily's, unmistakably hers, but it wasn't right. It was echoed, stretched, as though two voices were laughing at once, her daughter's and something older, mocking. Sarah bolted into Emily's bedroom, heart slamming, and found her daughter sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring at the boarded-up door across the hall. Her lips were moving silently, whispering something Sarah couldn't hear. "Emily!" Sarah snapped, louder than she intended. The girl flinched, her eyes glassy, as though she had just been shaken awake from a trance. "What were you saying?" Sarah demanded. Emily blinked. "She was teaching me her name." Sarah's throat tightened. "Whose name?" "The girl in the room." Emily smiled faintly, her voice dreamy. "She says I already know it. I just have to remember." That night, Sarah dreamed again. This time, she stood in the cold room with Emily beside her. The boards on the door were gone, the space empty except for the spreading frost on the floorboards, weaving outward like veins. The girl stood in the far corner, half-shadowed, her features blurred as though painted in smoke. She raised a hand and beckoned Emily closer. When Sarah tried to reach for her daughter, her feet were frozen to the floor. her skin cracked, her breath spilling white. Emily's small hand slipped from hers, drifting toward the girl. Then the figure finally stepped into the pale light, and Sarah's scream caught in her chest. The girl's face was Emily's, paler, gaunter, her eyes too wide, her smile too sharp. Sarah woke drenched in sweat, the echo of that smile burned into her mind. She sat up, trembling, and looked across the room. Emily was standing in the doorway, her nightgown brushing the floor, her eyes open but empty, staring at her mother with a look that wasn't hers. And in the silence, Sarah swore she heard the faintest voice whisper from behind the plywood boards down the hall. "She belongs to me now." Sarah's scream died in her throat before it could leave her lips. She sat frozen on the edge of the bed, staring at her daughter's small figure in the doorway. Emily's eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to pierce through the dark, gleaming faintly as though they caught light from somewhere that didn't exist. The child didn't move, didn't speak, only stood there, her arms limp at her sides, her head tilted just slightly, like a doll left too long in one position. "Emily?" Sarah whispered, her voice a tremor. At the sound of her name, the girl blinked slowly, her expression shifting from blank to puzzled, as though waking from sleep without realizing she'd been standing at her mother's door. "Mommy," she murmured, her voice small and fragile. "Why are you scared?" Sarah's chest clenched. She forced her lips into a shaky smile. "I'm not scared, sweetheart. Come here." Emily padded across the floor, her bare feet whispering against the hardwood, and climbed onto the bed without hesitation. She nestled into Sarah's arms, warm and real and familiar, but Sarah couldn't shake the image of the vacant-eyed figure in the doorway, staring with a look that hadn't belonged to her daughter at all. She stroked Emily's hair until she felt the girl's breathing slow, then heavy, slipping back into sleep. Only when Emily's body grew slack in her arms did Sarah allow herself to release the breath she'd been holding, though her own body trembled so violently she thought her bones might shatter. The next morning, Tom left early for work, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He'd been quieter lately, as though the weight of the house pressed against him too, though he tried to mask it with forced practicality. Sarah remained at the kitchen table long after he left, staring into her untouched coffee. The house was too still, too quiet, the silence pressing against her ears until she thought she'd go mad. She flinched when she noticed Emily sitting at the end of the hallway, cross-legged on the floor. The child was humming softly, a tune Sarah didn't recognize, low, repetitive, almost like a lullaby. In her lap, Emily held one of her dolls, rocking it back and forth with mechanical patience. Sarah forced herself to speak, though her voice wavered. "What are you humming, sweetie?" Emily lifted her head. Her smile was faint but strange, stretched a little too wide. "It's the song she taught me." Sarah's skin prickled. "Who?" "The girl in the room." Emily's tone was matter-of-fact, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. "She says she remembers Mommy too. From before." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Her throat closed, choking off the words before she could demand to know what Emily meant. From before? Before what? The humming resumed, soft and persistent, filling the house with a sound that seemed to echo off the walls. Sarah began noticing changes in the air itself. The house no longer smelled faintly of rot, it reeked of it, the odor seeping through vents and floorboards no matter how often she scrubbed or sprayed. The air felt heavier, too, thick and weighted, clinging to her skin in a clammy film. Even sunlight seemed wrong. When it streamed through the windows in the late afternoon, it appeared weak, dulled, as if the glass filtered out all warmth. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the floorboards, bending at odd angles, pointing always, it seemed, toward the boarded-up cold room. She couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. The house wasn't just sick, it was hungry. By the 6th week, Tom was different too. He came home late, drank more than usual, and avoided Sarah's eyes when she tried to talk about Emily. "She's just adjusting," he muttered. "Kids make up stories. You're feeding into it." But Sarah saw the way his hands shook when he walked past the upstairs hall, how he flinched if the cold air brushed his neck. She saw him jump awake in the middle of the night, breathing fast, sweat soaking the sheets. And she saw the bruised crescents beneath his eyes, proof he was not sleeping either. One night, after Emily had gone to bed, Sarah confronted him in the kitchen. "Something is wrong with her, Tom. With this house. We can't keep pretending. Enough." His voice cracked like a whip, sharper than she'd ever heard. He slammed his glass onto the counter, liquid sloshing over the rim. "We're not running again. Not this time." Sarah froze. Again? The word pierced her like a knife. They had never spoken of moving before, not in these terms. She wanted to press him, to demand what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't anger. It was fear, raw and deep, the kind of fear that made a man lash out because he couldn't admit the truth aloud. That night, the hammering began again. Sarah lay awake, clutching Emily to her chest, listening as the pounding rattled through the walls. It was slower this time, more deliberate. Bang. Pause. Bang. Pause. As if whatever was inside was no longer trying to escape, but sending a message. Each strike seemed to pulse through the house, through her chest, sinking with her heartbeat until she thought her ribcage would split open. Then the sound changed. No longer hammering, scratching. Long, ragged claws dragging against wood. The sound traced along the wall, across the boards, then down the hallway until it stopped outside Sarah's bedroom. She clutched Emily tighter, her own breath shallow, waiting for the doorknob to rattle again. But instead came a voice. Not whispered this time, not distant. A voice pressed close to the wood, so close she could hear the breath behind it. "She doesn't belong to you anymore." The words slithered through her veins like venom. Emily stirred against her chest, smiling faintly in her sleep, as though she'd been waiting for those words. Sarah wept silently, rocking her daughter, staring at the door as if sheer will could keep it shut. The next morning, the plywood covering the cold room was split down the middle. The nails were bent outward, as though something inside had pressed, hard and patient, until the barrier broke. A gap no wider than a hand stretched down the center, revealing only darkness beyond. And on the floor in front of the door, perfectly centered, lay Emily's favorite doll. Its head was turned toward the gap, its stitched mouth split at the seam, as if it had been smiling. Sarah stared at the broken plywood until her eyes burned. The jagged split cut down the center of the boards like a wound, black and gaping, and the doll sitting before it seemed like an offering, placed carefully, deliberately, as though Emily had been coaxed into leaving it there. The sight made bile rise in her throat. She bent quickly, snatching up the doll, but the moment her fingers closed around it, a deep chill radiated up her arm. She dropped it with a cry. The plastic face had gone slick and clammy, as though dredged from water, and in the faint morning light, Sarah could swear the glassy eyes rolled toward her. Emily's voice drifted down the hallway. "Where's Lily?" Sarah spun around, her daughter standing just behind her, head tilted, eyes locked on the doll. Her voice was calm, too calm for a child. "She doesn't like to be alone." Before Sarah could answer, Tom appeared from their bedroom, his hair disheveled, his face pale with exhaustion. He took one look at the broken plywood, then at Sarah's shaking hands, and his expression hardened. "Pack a bag," he said. "We're leaving." Relief flooded Sarah so swiftly she nearly collapsed. Finally, he understood. Finally, he was willing to run. But even as she reached for Emily, even as she clutched her daughter's small hand in her own, Sarah saw the flicker of resistance in the girl's eyes. "I don't want to go," Emily whispered. "She says it'll be worse if we leave." The words sent a cold stab through Sarah's chest. They left anyway. Tom ushered them quickly to the car, throwing duffel bags into the trunk. Sarah didn't even remember packing, just shoving clothes and essentials into bags with frantic hands, desperate to escape before the house could change its mind. The moment the car engine roared to life, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. But as they pulled out of the driveway, Emily pressed her face against the window, staring back at the house. Her lips moved silently, forming words Sarah couldn't hear. When Sarah leaned closer, she realized her daughter was mouthing goodbye. The motel they found on the edge of town was nothing special: peeling wallpaper, buzzing neon sign outside, the faint smell of cigarettes seeping through the walls. But Sarah welcomed it like a sanctuary. She tucked Emily into one of the beds, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead, whispering lullabies until the child's eyes fluttered shut. For the first time in weeks, Sarah thought they might be safe. But safety was an illusion. At 3:07 a.m., Sarah jolted awake. Not from a sound, but from the sudden, piercing cold. She sat up in the dim glow of the bedside lamp and felt it instantly, the same brittle, unnatural chill that had haunted the upstairs room. Her breath fogged in the air. She turned toward Emily's bed. It was empty. Panic surged. She stumbled out of bed, heart hammering, scanning the room. The bathroom door hung open, the light inside flickering faintly. Sarah rushed toward it, then froze. The sound of giggling drifted from within. Emily's voice. But doubled again, stretched, echoed, like it had been dragged across ice. "Emily?" Sarah called, her voice breaking. The giggling stopped. Silence pressed heavy. Then, slowly, the bathroom light flickered once more, and there she was, Emily, standing in front of the mirror. Only she wasn't alone. Her reflection didn't match her movements. Emily tilted her head left. The reflection tilted right. Emily blinked once. The reflection didn't blink at all. Sarah's knees nearly gave way. "Emily, come here," she cried, reaching forward. Emily turned toward her mother with wide, innocent eyes, but the reflection in the mirror smiled, a crooked, wide, too-sharp grin that belonged to neither child nor human. Sarah screamed, grabbing her daughter and yanking her away from the mirror. The glass shuddered, a faint web of frost spreading outward from where the reflection's hand pressed against it, leaving behind a foggy imprint as though trying to push through. She slammed the bathroom door shut, clutching Emily against her chest, rocking her back and forth while whispering, it's okay, I've got you," though the words sounded hollow. Lies meant more for herself than her daughter. Emily whispered into her mother's ear, so softly Sarah almost didn't catch it. "She found us." By the next morning, Tom was already on the phone, calling anyone who might help, a priest, a contractor, anyone willing to come look at the house. But Sarah couldn't stop shaking, her mind replaying the image of that reflection, the smile that had no right to exist. She wanted to leave Massachusetts altogether, to vanish into another state, another life, but Emily refused. "She'll follow," the girl said simply, as though stating a fact of nature, like rain or snow. When Tom insisted they return, Sarah nearly screamed at him. "Go back? Are you insane? That thing, whatever it is, it's in her now." She clutched Emily close, her voice breaking. "We can't bring her back there." But Tom's voice was quiet, grim. "If we don't, it'll only get worse." Sarah wanted to argue, to fight, but deep down she already knew he was right. The cold wasn't just tied to the house anymore. It was tied to them. That evening, back in the motel, Sarah dozed off for only a moment, exhaustion dragging her under. She woke to find Emily sitting upright on the bed, staring at the wall. Her small hands were folded neatly in her lap. Sarah whispered her name, but Emily didn't answer. Then she realized the girl wasn't staring at the wall at all. She was staring at the motel's door. On the inside of the door, thin lines of frost began to bloom, curling outward in delicate, crystalline veins. They spread quickly, weaving across the wood in patterns that looked disturbingly like hands pressing from the other side. Sarah's body turned to ice. And then, faint but clear, came the voice she'd heard too many times already. Only this time, it wasn't muffled, wasn't distant. It was right there, whispering through the frost. "You can't keep her from me." The frost cracked, the wood groaned, and Sarah realized with dawning horror that it didn't matter where they went. The cold room wasn't in the house anymore. It was following them. Sarah pressed herself against the far wall of the motel room, clutching Emily so tightly the child whimpered against her chest. The frost on the door thickened, each vein of ice cracking across the wood like the webbing of a frozen spider. The air grew so cold it burned her lungs to breathe, and the dim yellow bulb overhead flickered violently, struggling against the encroaching dark. She thought for a moment that the wood might splinter, that whatever was pressing from the other side would force its way in. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the frost stopped spreading. The silence that followed was more suffocating than the cold itself. Sarah felt her heart pound against Emily's small body, the drumbeat of terror threatening to split her ribs. She waited, her breath caught in her throat, eyes locked on the door, praying it wouldn't open. Tom had fallen asleep in the chair near the window, but the sound of cracking wood had jolted him awake. He stumbled to his feet, his face pale and drawn. "What the hell happened?" he whispered, his voice low as if afraid the room itself might overhear. Sarah's words spilled out between shivering lips. "It's here, Tom. It doesn't matter where we go, it's with us now." Emily raised her head slowly, her small eyes gleaming in the dim light. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even afraid. She looked strangely calm, like a child listening to a bedtime story she already knew the ending of. "She said she doesn't like waiting," she whispered. The words froze Sarah's blood more than the frost ever could. By dawn, the frost had melted, leaving behind warped wood and a damp patch of carpet beneath the door. Tom insisted they leave immediately, tossing their belongings back into the car without caring whether anything was missing. Sarah held Emily close, carrying her like she was a newborn again, afraid to let her feet touch the ground. The drive was quiet at first, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen rode along with them. The car heater blasted at full strength, yet the windows began to fog from the inside. She wiped one clear with her sleeve and gasped. On the glass, in the condensation, tiny handprints had formed. Not Emily's. Smaller. Dozens of them. She turned sharply, expecting to see someone crouched in the back seat, but there was nothing there, only Emily, slumped against the window, her lips moving silently. Sarah grabbed her daughter's arm. "What are you saying?" Emily blinked slowly, as though waking from a trance, but her answer made Sarah's stomach twist. "She's just telling me where we're going." Sarah's gaze darted to Tom, her panic rising, but he kept his eyes glued to the road, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. It was as if he'd already surrendered, as if he believed there was no point in fighting anymore. They ended up back at the house. Sarah screamed when Tom turned into the driveway, clawing at his arm, demanding he stop. "No, Tom. Don't you dare. We can't go back in there." But Tom's eyes were wet, hollow. "It doesn't matter where we go. You saw it yourself. It'll follow us. Maybe this is the only place we have a chance to understand it." Sarah shook her head violently, tears streaking down her face, but Emily sat up suddenly in the back seat, her expression eerily serene. "She's right. It started here. It has to end here." The words didn't sound like her daughter's at all. They sounded older. Wiser. Something borrowed. Inside, the house felt changed. Not alive exactly, but watchful. The cold room at the end of the hall seemed to breathe, its broken plywood patch gaping wider than ever. The air around it shimmered faintly, like heat rising off asphalt, but instead of warmth, it exhaled pure, biting cold. Sarah refused to step closer, but Tom moved toward the door, drawn like a moth to flame. He placed a trembling hand against the warped frame, his breath visible in the hallway. "It's not just a room," he whispered. "It's waiting. For something." Sarah wanted to drag him away, to scream sense into him, but she couldn't ignore the truth that pulsed in her gut. The house wasn't haunted in the way stories described. It wasn't holding on to the past, it was hungry for the future. Emily walked past them both, barefoot on the freezing wood floor, and stopped directly in front of the door. Her doll, Lily, was already there, sitting in the same spot where Sarah had last seen it, as if it had never left. Emily bent down and picked it up, then turned to her parents. "She says it's almost time." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, staring into the dark, listening to the groans and sighs of the house as the wind pushed against its bones. Every creak sounded deliberate, like footsteps just out of sight. She thought about leaving again, about dragging Emily out while Tom slept and never looking back. But then she heard it, the sound of a child's laughter drifting through the vents. Not Emily's. A chorus of voices, dozens of them, all laughing softly together. Sarah pressed her hands over her ears, rocking in the chair, but the laughter didn't stop. It seeped through the walls, through the floor, even through her skin. She realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from the vents at all. It was coming from beneath the house. When she finally mustered the courage to check on Emily, she found her daughter sitting cross-legged in the cold room's doorway. The plywood patch was gone entirely now. The opening yawned wide, black and endless, a void so deep the light of the hallway seemed to bend around it. Frost feathered out across the floor from its threshold, spreading slowly outward like a living thing. Emily turned to look at her mother, her eyes heavy-lidded, her lips curling into a small smile. "She wants you to see," she whispered. Sarah's legs nearly gave out as she staggered forward, unable to stop herself. She reached the doorway and peered inside. For just a second, just one unbearable heartbeat, she saw movement in the dark. Shapes shifting. Hands reaching. Faces pressed just below the surface of shadow, mouths open in silent screams. And in the center of it all, something vast and shapeless stared back. Not with eyes, but with hunger. Sarah staggered back from the doorway, her chest heaving, her throat tight with a scream that refused to escape. The darkness inside the cold room was no longer simply dark. It felt alive, writhing, an ocean of shadow that breathed in time with her own panicked heartbeat. The shapes she had glimpsed, hands, faces, those impossible shifting forms, burned into her vision, lingering even after she squeezed her eyes shut. She could still feel them reaching, their frozen fingers stretching just shy of her skin, hungry for contact. Emily sat calmly on the floor, cradling her doll as though nothing was amiss. Her lips moved in soundless whispers, like she was holding a secret conversation only she could hear. Sarah fell to her knees beside her, grabbing her shoulders, shaking her harder than she meant to. "Emily! Look at me! Stay away from that door!" The girl's gaze slid lazily to her mother's face, her small smile never faltering. "She's not angry with you," she said softly. "She knows you're scared. She says it'll be easier if you don't fight." Sarah's stomach turned to ice. Her hands dropped from Emily's shoulders, trembling so violently she had to press them against the floor to steady herself. The child's words weren't spoken with malice or defiance, they carried the quiet assurance of someone repeating a promise given directly to her. Tom appeared in the hallway then, his face drawn, his body slouched as though the weight of the past nights had carved into his very bones. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips cracked from the dry chill that seemed to seep into the air itself. He didn't ask what Sarah had seen. He didn't even glance at Emily. His gaze was fixed entirely on the room, on the pulsing black hollow that devoured the end of the hall. "It's not random," he murmured, his voice distant, almost reverent. "I've been looking. I don't think it just happened. This house was built here for a reason." Sarah snapped her head toward him, fury sparking in the place where fear should have been. "Are you even listening to yourself? Our daughter is talking to that thing, and you want to stand here and analyze it?" Tom finally turned his face toward her, his expression raw. "Don't you get it? We can't run. We already tried. Whatever this is, it's part of us now. If we don't figure out why it wants us, it'll never let go." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to tear him away from the door, but deep down she felt the truth of his words. The cold wasn't just a haunting or a curse, it was tethered to them. To Emily most of all. That night, Sarah dreamed. She was standing in the cold room again, only this time the door had vanished, and she was inside the abyss itself. The air was so frigid it burned her lungs, but the shadows around her shifted like liquid. And then the faces emerged. Dozens of them. Children, adults, men and women, all pale, their eyes hollow, their mouths opening in voiceless cries. Their skin was cracked with frost, their hair brittle like glass. They didn't move toward her, but she felt them pressing against her, crowding in, suffocating. At the center of them, towering and formless, was the presence. A vast, undulating shape, sometimes human and sometimes not, its edges dissolving into the dark. It radiated hunger, but also patience, a predator that didn't need to chase because its prey would always come willingly. When she tried to run, her legs sank into the darkness like quicksand. And then she heard it, Emily's laughter, high and innocent, echoing through the void. Sarah screamed her daughter's name. The shape leaned closer, and in the hollow echo of its breath, a whisper slithered into her ear. Preserve. She jolted awake drenched in sweat, her skin ice-cold despite the layers of blankets around her. The days that followed blurred together. The house grew colder, no matter how high they cranked the heat. Pipes froze, wallpaper curled away from damp walls, food spoiled within hours of being set out. Mold spread across ceilings in strange, spindly patterns, like veins branching from an invisible heart. And Emily changed. At first, it was subtle, her voice softening, her words taking on an eerie calm. She spent hours staring into corners, whispering to Lily, her doll, as if relaying instructions. But soon it became undeniable. Her eyes seemed too sharp for her face, too knowing. She stopped eating, yet never complained of hunger. She woke each morning with frost clinging to her eyelashes, as though she had slept in snow. Tom tried to research everything he could, old blueprints of the house, property records, folklore from the area. He scoured the internet, called libraries, even reached out to local historians. But answers were scarce, replaced instead with fragments of rumor. A house that never stayed in one family long. A property locals avoided. Whispers of disappearances. Sarah, meanwhile, grew weaker. Each time she walked past the cold room, she felt drained, as though something invisible leached the warmth straight from her bones. She took to avoiding the upstairs entirely, sleeping on the couch downstairs with the lights on, a blanket wrapped tightly around her shivering frame. But Emily always drifted back to the room. No matter where they placed her, she returned, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes in plain daylight, always drawn, always waiting at the threshold. One evening, as Sarah sat curled on the couch, she heard footsteps above her. Not the heavy tread of Tom, but the light, playful patter of a child. Her stomach clenched. Emily was supposed to be asleep. She bolted upstairs, heart hammering, and found the cold room door wide open. Emily was inside, sitting on the floor mere inches from the yawning black. Frost had spread outward, crystallizing across her hair and nightgown, shimmering faintly in the moonlight. "Emily, no!" Sarah cried, rushing forward, scooping her into her arms. But the child didn't resist. She leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, her skin icy to the touch. "She says it won't hurt," Emily murmured, her voice so faint it almost vanished into the air. "She just wants to keep us safe. She says the world is ending, and this is the only way to survive." Sarah froze in the doorway, Emily's words rattling through her mind like shards of glass. The cold room wasn't simply consuming. It was offering. And for the first time, Sarah wondered with bone-deep dread if Tom had been right, if understanding what it wanted wasn't just necessary, but inevitable. Tom hadn't slept in nearly 2 days. His eyes were sunken, ringed with bruised shadows, his stubble patchy across his jaw. The kitchen table was littered with papers, old deeds, printed articles, hand-scribbled notes on napkins and receipts. He traced lines across maps, circling the lot their house sat on as if the answers were etched into the soil itself. Sarah hovered in the doorway, Emily asleep upstairs, the weight of silence pressing between them. "You're going to make yourself sick," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "None of this is helping. None of this is stopping what's happening." Tom didn't look up. His finger dragged across another photocopied page, this one from a brittle local paper nearly 50 years old. "It's not random, Sarah. This land has been built on 3 times before. Farmhouse in the 1800s. Burned down. A boarding house in the 1920s. Collapsed under structural failure. then another home in the 1950s, family vanished without a trace. His eyes finally met hers, wild and glassy. Every generation or so, something happens here. It's always this land. Always this place. Sarah shook her head, clutching her arms around her chest. So what, Tom? You want to dig up a graveyard? Find out who we're sharing the house with? This isn't history anymore, it's happening now. It has Emily. Her voice cracked on her daughter's name. Tom's jaw tightened. Which is why we need to know what it wants. If every family who lived here disappeared, why? What happened to them? If we don't figure it out, we'll be next. That night, Sarah couldn't bring herself to sleep. She lay on the couch, blanket pulled tight, staring at the ceiling as though the wood above might give way. Around 2 a.m., the house stirred. She heard it, not pipes or wind, but something deliberate. A low hum, deep in the walls, vibrating through the floorboards. And then the cold came. It spread like a tide, seeping down the staircase, pouring across the living room. Frost bloomed across the television screen, webbing the glass in delicate veins. Sarah's breath fogged in the air. She scrambled upright, heart pounding, her eyes darting toward the stairs. Emily stood there. Her small frame was silhouetted in the dark, but her eyes caught the faint glow of the streetlight outside, gleaming pale and glassy. She clutched Lily to her chest, her nightgown clinging to her like it had been dipped in snowmelt. Emily? Sarah whispered. Her daughter didn't move. But her lips parted, and a voice emerged, thin, distorted, layered as though more than one mouth spoke through her. It's opening. The words rattled Sarah's bones. By morning, Tom had found more. He shoved a stack of brittle documents toward her while Emily ate breakfast in silence, dragging her spoon across a bowl of untouched cereal. There are references, Tom said, his voice hoarse, to what they used to call it. The locals. They called it the preservation room. Not a haunting, not a curse. He swallowed, his throat working. A safeguard. That's why the room stays cold. It's preserving something. Sarah's stomach turned. Preserving what? Tom looked at Emily then, his silence louder than any answer. Emily smiled faintly, staring into her milk, humming a tune that Sarah didn't recognize but chilled her all the same. Later that day, Sarah ventured upstairs, unable to resist the pull of dread any longer. The cold room's door stood ajar, though neither she nor Tom had opened it. Inside, the void pulsed faintly, like a great lung inhaling and exhaling. Frost crackled across the threshold. She stepped closer, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath clouding in front of her. And then she saw them, words etched faintly into the frost along the doorframe. Not scratched, not carved, but written in condensation as though someone had traced them with a fingertip. She is the vessel. Her scream tore from her throat before she even realized it, her body lurching backward, her feet tangling in the hallway rug. She crashed against the opposite wall, gasping, her skin crawling. Tom came running, grabbing her by the shoulders, demanding to know what happened. But when she pointed, when she sobbed that the words were still there, the frame was bare. Empty. Only wood and frost. Tom held her, but his embrace was hollow. She felt him trembling too. That night, Sarah woke to the sound of whispers. Not the sharp laughter of before, not the groaning of the house. These were softer, closer, threading through the dark like strands of silk. She turned her head and found Emily standing by her side of the couch, staring down at her with eyes wide and glassy. "Mommy," Emily whispered, her voice clear this time. "She says you don't have to be afraid. She says when the world breaks, we'll be safe. She'll keep us whole. She'll freeze us before the fire comes." Sarah's skin crawled. She sat up, cupping Emily's face, her voice breaking. "Baby, listen to me. That thing is lying to you. It doesn't want to keep you safe. It wants to take you." Emily tilted her head, smiling softly in the dim glow. "But Mommy, it already has." Her words echoed in the silence. Sarah stared into her daughter's face, searching for something, fear, resistance, even recognition, but all she saw was calm acceptance. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air denser, as though the house itself were holding its breath. And for the first time, Sarah realized the cold wasn't just stealing Emily. It was changing her. Tom returned from town with a cardboard box full of records, newspaper clippings, and yellowing maps that smelled of mildew. He set them on the kitchen table like sacred offerings, his hands trembling with both exhaustion and excitement. Sarah hovered by the sink, her arms crossed tight, watching her husband unravel. His eyes had taken on a feverish gleam, as if the answers he chased were just out of reach but too important to stop running toward. "I found it," he said, rifling through the papers until he pulled out a brittle sheet. His voice cracked with a manic edge. "This land, it's been feared for longer than we thought. Even before the settlers, the tribes here avoided it. They called it the still place. The stories say it was where the earth froze, where time itself stopped moving." He looked at her then, his eyes burning. "They thought it was a kind of sanctuary. Not evil. Protective. Like a vault." Sarah shook her head violently. "Protective? Tom, it's sucking the life out of this house, out of us. You've seen what it's doing to Emily." Tom slammed the papers onto the table, his voice rising. "Don't you see? That's the point. It's preserving her. Keeping her from whatever's coming. Maybe it's the only reason anyone survives." Sarah recoiled, her heart clenching in her chest. She didn't recognize this man anymore. The rational, grounded man she married had been replaced by someone ready to surrender their daughter to the abyss. That evening, Sarah found Emily in the cold room again, perched at the threshold like a sentinel. Her doll rested in her lap, and the frost spread out beneath her like a throne of ice. The void pulsed faintly, its depths darker than any night sky, and every time Sarah looked too long, she thought she saw movement within, shadows shifting, waiting. Emily's voice was low, almost a hum. "She says Daddy is right. She says the fire is coming soon, and we'll all burn unless we let her keep us." Sarah dropped to her knees, grabbing Emily's icy hands. "Listen to me, baby. That thing isn't your friend. It doesn't care about us. It doesn't care about keeping us safe. It's lying." Emily tilted her head, her eyes glinting in the dim hallway light. "But Mommy, she says you already belong to her too. You felt it, haven't you? The way the cold doesn't let go." Sarah's throat tightened. Because Emily was right. The chill had lingered in her bones for days now, no matter how many blankets she wrapped around herself, no matter how long she stayed by the heater. It was inside her. Crawling deeper. That night, Sarah dreamed again. She was standing in the middle of town, but it wasn't the town she knew. The streets were empty, the buildings hollowed shells, their windows shattered. Snow drifted down in heavy sheets, piling against doorways, smothering everything in silence. And everywhere she looked, she saw figures frozen mid-step, men, women, children, locked in place with frost climbing up their skin. Their eyes were open, glassy and lifeless, as if time had simply stopped for them all at once. At the center of town was her own house, standing impossibly tall, its roof cracked and sagging, but its cold room glowing faintly like a beacon. She heard a voice then, rippling through the icy wind. Not spoken, not human. A chorus of whispers woven into one. Preserve. Shelter. Keep. The fire comes. Only the stillness survives. Sarah woke with a strangled cry, sweat chilling her body, her skin numb as if she had actually been buried in snow. The following day, Tom was gone when she woke. His car was missing from the driveway. Panic seized her chest, but before she could call him, the phone rang. She snatched it up, her voice breaking. It was Tom. His words were rushed, frantic, echoing with the buzz of a payphone. "Sarah, I found something. The boarding house records, there were survivors. A few people made it out. They wrote about visions, warnings. They said the room kept them safe when the fires came. His breathing was harsh, ragged. "It's happening again, Sarah. That's why it's calling to Emily. She's the vessel. She'll anchor us when it starts." Sarah's knees buckled. She gripped the counter, her mind reeling. "Tom, listen to me, this isn't salvation, it's possession. It's trying to take her, not save her." But the line crackled, his voice warping. "You'll see. When it begins, you'll beg to be preserved." The line went dead. Sarah turned, her hand shaking around the receiver. Emily stood in the doorway, staring at her with those glassy eyes, her doll clutched tight. "Daddy understands now," she said softly. "Soon you will too." The words struck Sarah like a blade. Her daughter's lips had moved, but she wasn't sure the voice was hers. It sounded deeper. Ancient. The kitchen light flickered, and for just a heartbeat, Sarah thought she saw frost bloom across the walls, curling outward in veins that spelled words too fast to read. The cold room wasn't waiting anymore. It was preparing. The days that followed bled into one another, thick with unease, each sunrise feeling like a hollow promise. Sarah barely slept, jolting awake at the sound of every creak, every sigh of the house settling. The air was growing colder, not just in the room anymore but throughout the home, seeping into the walls, the floorboards, and even her own body. She wrapped herself in layers, but the chill sank through them, unbothered, as though it lived beneath her skin now. Emily moved through the house like a ghost, drifting to and from the cold room, whispering to her doll, her breath visible in faint white plumes even in broad daylight. Sarah tried to distract her, cooking pancakes, setting up board games, turning on cartoons, but Emily's attention always wandered, her gaze snapping toward the hallway that led to the room. It was as if an invisible thread pulled at her, tugging her back to the doorway where frost bloomed like delicate white veins on the wooden frame. Each time Sarah pulled her away, Emily resisted harder, her small body surprisingly strong, her voice dripping with words that didn't sound like a child's. "She wants me, Mommy. She needs me. If you don't let me go, we'll all burn." Sarah knew she had to get out. The house was rotting her daughter from the inside, twisting her into something else. But when she bundled Emily into the car, the engine refused to turn over, coughing once before sputtering into silence. The dashboard lights flickered wildly, then went black. Panic clawed at her chest. She tried again and again, her hands trembling on the key, but nothing. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat, her doll upright in her lap, her glassy stare fixed on the house looming behind them. "You can't leave," Emily whispered, her voice distant, layered with a resonance that didn't belong to her. "She won't let you." Sarah's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She looked up and swore she saw frost spiderwebbing across the inside of the windshield. She abandoned the car, dragging Emily back inside as icy air bit at her skin, the world outside suddenly brittle and unwelcoming. The next day, Sarah ventured into town, her breath fogging even in the weak sunlight. Something felt wrong the moment she stepped onto Main Street. The air was colder here too, sharper, as though the chill from the house had spread like a sickness. People walked quickly, bundled in coats despite the season, their faces pale and drawn. Conversations were hushed, eyes darting toward the hills where the house stood. At the grocery store, Sarah overheard two old men whispering near the coffee shelves. "Cold's not natural," one muttered. "Never comes this early, not this deep." "Same as before." "Don't talk about it," the other hissed. "Don't give it power." Sarah froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Same as before." She moved closer, pretending to browse, but the men clammed up the moment they noticed her listening. Their stares lingered on her a moment too long, suspicion and fear mingling in their eyes, before they shuffled off. It wasn't just her family's burden. The cold room's reach was spreading. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with a stack of the documents Tom had brought home, her fingers numb as she leafed through brittle pages of testimony from people who'd once lived in the boarding house. Their accounts were fractured, half delirious, filled with talk of visions, voices, and promises of safety from the fire. Some spoke of family members vanishing into the cold room and never coming back, preserved in ways that defied explanation. Others claim they survived while their neighbors burned alive in houses that seemed to ignite from the inside. Sarah read one passage over and over, her stomach twisting. The fire ate everything but the stillness. Those taken into the stillness never screamed, never burned. They were kept whole, waiting for the world to end. She shoved the papers away, bile rising in her throat. What did it mean? Fire, stillness, preservation, it all sounded like madness. And yet, the cold creeping through her walls, the way Emily's skin felt like ice, the way Tom had vanished into obsession, it was too real to dismiss. Sleep came only in jagged pieces. When Sarah finally drifted off, she dreamed of fire. She stood at the edge of the town, flames rising like tidal waves, devouring houses, trees, cars. The heat was unbearable, her skin blistering, the air itself aflame. People ran, their screams muffled by the roar, their bodies collapsing into ash mid-step. And in the center of it all stood Emily. Her daughter stood calmly in the street, untouched by the inferno, frost radiating outward from her body in delicate spirals that froze the ground beneath her feet. The flames bent away from her, writhing, unable to touch her. And behind her loomed the cold room, its door wide open, a black maw waiting to swallow what remained. Emily turned her head, her eyes pale and glimmering like glass. "The fire's almost here, Mommy," she whispered. "She says you'll understand soon." Sarah woke screaming, drenched in sweat, her skin clammy with cold that wasn't sweat at all, it was frost, tiny crystals forming along her arms that melted into damp streaks when she sat up. The house groaned that night, a long, low sound like ice splitting on a frozen lake. Sarah clutched Emily tight, refusing to let her sleep in the cold room again, but Emily resisted with unnatural strength, her voice rising into a shrill wail that rattled the walls. "She's coming. If you don't let me go, she won't save us." Sarah held her tighter, tears streaming down her face, whispering over and over, "I won't lose you. I won't." But deep down, a part of her wondered if she already had. The next morning dawned gray, heavy clouds pressing low over the town, the air so sharp and brittle it felt like glass in Sarah's lungs. She clutched a mug of coffee between her hands, but even the steam curled weakly, fading as though the heat itself was being devoured by the creeping cold. Emily sat across from her at the table, her doll propped neatly in front of her like a second child. The little girl's lips were pale, her cheeks devoid of color, but her eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. Sarah forced herself to look away, because every time she stared too long, she felt the same dizzying tug she felt when looking into the cold room itself, as if Emily were becoming less her daughter and more the mouthpiece of something vast and unknowable. The house made its displeasure known that day. Windows fogged over from the inside, a thin crust of frost spreading outward in fractal patterns that looked disturbingly like veins. The walls groaned with a sound deeper than wood settling, it was the groan of ice shifting, cracking, threatening to snap. Sarah followed the sound down the hallway, heart hammering, and found the door to the cold room standing open again, though she could have sworn she had locked it the night before. Inside, the frost had grown thicker, curling down the walls in white ridges, the floorboards glistening as though coated in glass. The void pulsed faintly, the dark within alive with movement, and Sarah swore she heard faint whispers drifting from its depths, overlapping, dozens of voices murmuring in a language she didn't know. Yet she understood the cadence, the rhythm, it was summoning. She tried to bar the door, dragging an old dresser across the threshold, but as soon as she stepped back, the mirror on the opposite wall cracked down the middle, sending a jagged scream through the house. Emily appeared behind her then, silent, watching with unblinking eyes. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Mommy," Emily said softly, "you don't have to fight her. She's only trying to keep us safe. She says the fire is closer now. She says she can smell the smoke." Sarah shook her head violently. "No. No, that thing is lying. It doesn't care about us. It's using you." Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile, a mimicry of innocence that chilled Sarah more than the frost ever could. "Then why is the town already burning?" Later that day, Sarah drove back into town, though the car's heater blasted nothing but cold air against her face. She hadn't wanted to believe Emily's words, but the moment she turned onto Main Street, her stomach dropped. People stood huddled in doorways, staring toward the horizon where a smear of orange smoke bled into the sky. The smell hit next, an acrid, searing stench of something burning, though no flames were yet visible. Children cried. Dogs barked furiously. And still, the air was frigid, unnaturally so, a jarring contradiction that made her skin crawl. At the general store, Sarah pressed a clerk for answers, her voice trembling. "What's happening? What's burning?" The woman shook her head, her eyes haunted. "Not sure. They say the fields past the highway caught fire. But no one knows how. It started in half a dozen places at once. And it's moving fast." She lowered her voice then, leaning closer. "My grandfather used to talk about this. Said it happened once before, long ago. Said the fire wasn't natural. Said it was a cleansing." Sarah's knees threatened to give way. She left before anyone could stop her, driving back home with her heart rattling in her chest, the word cleansing echoing in her mind. That night, Tom finally returned. His clothes were filthy, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with a terrifying conviction. He stood in the living room, a sheaf of old maps and letters clutched in his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's true, Sarah," he whispered. "Everything. The room, the fire. It's all happening again. The only ones who survived last time were the ones who surrendered to the cold. The room preserved them, froze them outside of time until the fire passed." Sarah shook her head, her body trembling with fury. "You're talking about handing over our daughter. You want to sacrifice her to that thing." Tom's eyes softened with something like pity. "It's not a sacrifice. It's salvation. She's the vessel, Sarah. The room chose her. Through her, it can keep us all." Sarah staggered back as if he'd struck her. "No. I won't let you give her away. She's our daughter, Tom, not some anchor for a nightmare." But Tom only looked toward the hallway, where the cold room pulsed faintly, the light in its depths flickering like a heartbeat. His voice was low, reverent. "It's already begun." That night, the fire arrived. Sarah woke to a deep rumbling, the ground itself trembling as though something massive shifted beneath it. She stumbled to the window and her blood ran cold. The horizon glowed with a sickly orange light, waves of fire rolling over the treetops, devouring the landscape with terrifying speed. The air outside shimmered, not with heat but with distortion, the flames bending in unnatural ways, twisting and writhing as though alive. Yet despite the inferno, frost crept up the inside of her windowpane, crystallizing into delicate patterns that spelled words she couldn't read fast enough before they faded. The fire was coming for them. It wasn't a wildfire, it was something older, hungrier, unstoppable. Behind her, she heard Emily's voice, calm and certain. "Mommy, it's time." Sarah turned to see her daughter standing in the doorway, her small hand extended, frost blooming beneath her bare feet. Behind her, the cold room pulsed with a light so deep it hurt to look at, the whispers rising into a chorus that filled the house. And for the first time, Sarah realized that she might not have a choice. The house shuddered as though struck by some invisible force, the walls rattling, plaster dust drifting down like ash. Sarah clutched Emily to her chest, her heart beat a violent drum in her ears. The roar outside was deafening now, a sound like the end of the world. She forced herself to look through the window again, and the sight nearly drove her to her knees. The fire was no longer creeping, it was consuming. A wave of living flame tore across the tree-line, bending unnaturally as if searching, reaching. It leapt from tree to tree, hungrily devouring, moving against the wind. It wasn't fire in the natural sense, it was something older, something sentient. The flames pulsed, and in their rippling she thought she saw faces screaming, whole forms writhing within the inferno as though swallowed souls still struggled inside. Tom stood at the end of the hallway, his eyes wide, his arms open toward Emily. "Sarah, we don't have time," he shouted over the roar. "If we don't give her to the room, we're all dead. Do you want her to burn, or do you want her to survive forever?" "Survive as what?" Sarah screamed back, her throat raw. As herself, or as something hollow wearing her skin. Emily squirmed in her arms then, her body trembling but not with fear, with something like anticipation. Her small voice whispered against Sarah's ear. "Mommy, it doesn't hurt. She says it feels like sleeping. She says when it's over, we'll wake up together." Sarah's grip faltered. For a moment she nearly gave in, nearly surrendered her child to the cold that promised safety, but something deep inside her screamed louder than the fire outside. This wasn't right. None of it. The walls of the house began to blacken and smoke, the flames pressing in on all sides, yet the air inside only grew colder, sharp as knives against her skin. Frost raced along the ceiling, dripping icicles from the beams, meeting the smoke in an unholy collision that hissed and spat. The cold room's door yawned wide, spilling its void into the hallway. The whispers inside had grown into a chant, hundreds of voices layered together in a harmony so deep it made her chest vibrate. She couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear: enter. Be still. Be kept. Tom lunged forward, trying to pry Emily from her arms, his face wild, desperate. "Sarah, let go. Don't you see? This is the only way. She's the key, the vessel. Through her, we're all preserved." Sarah shoved him back with every ounce of strength she had, her voice breaking with fury. "You're not saving her, you're feeding her to it." For the first time, Tom hesitated. His hands dropped, and in his eyes flickered the faintest doubt. But before he could speak, the house gave a sound like splitting timber, a deafening crack as the windows blew inward. A torrent of flame burst inside, crawling like a predator along the floor, licking at the furniture, searing the air. Sarah screamed and shielded Emily, expecting pain, but instead of burning, the fire recoiled at the frost blooming from the child's skin. It twisted, writhed, then bent away, unable to touch her. Emily stepped forward then, slipping free from Sarah's weakening grasp, her small bare feet padding across the frozen floor. She stood before the cold room, her doll dangling from her hand, her face serene. "It's not lying, Mommy," she said softly. "It's keeping us safe from them." Sarah's stomach dropped. Them? And then she understood. The fire wasn't an accident of nature, wasn't a curse. It was a predator. A thing that moved from place to place, devouring towns, feeding on human lives like fuel. The cold room wasn't the threat, it was the last defense, a vault of stillness that froze its chosen in place, keeping them hidden until the predator moved on. That was why the records spoke of preservation, of waiting until the fire passed. That was why the frost lingered even in summer, why shadows bent unnaturally. It wasn't haunting. It was protection. But the protection came at a price. The portal wasn't strong enough on its own. It needed an anchor, a vessel to hold the preservation in place, to bridge its void with the living. And this time, it had chosen Emily. Sarah's heart broke as her daughter placed one small hand against the frozen doorframe. The cold surged outward like a wave, rushing past Sarah's ankles, biting her skin until it went numb. The fire outside screamed in frustration, slamming against the house but never breaching the cold that poured from the room. Emily turned back once, her glassy eyes meeting her mother's. For just a moment, Sarah saw her daughter as she truly was, frightened, trembling, wanting her mother's arms, but then the light shifted and the otherness returned. "Come with me," Emily whispered. "We'll be safe. Forever." Tom was already moving toward her, ready to step into the void without hesitation. Sarah's body shook with indecision. The fire was nearly upon them, the house creaking, the walls glowing red with heat, yet where the cold reached, the flames shrank back. She could step into that darkness, let herself be preserved, locked away until the world outside turned to ash. She could live, but not really live. Not as herself. The choice was unbearable. In the end, Sarah did the only thing a mother could do. She rushed forward, grabbing Emily's face in her hands, forcing her to look into her eyes. "I love you," she whispered fiercely, her tears freezing as they fell. "And I won't let you be a prisoner. Not even for me. Not even for the world. With one desperate motion, she yanked her daughter back from the doorway, tearing her free from the cold's grasp. Emily screamed, the sound layered with countless voices, and the cold shrieked in fury. The void pulsed, the walls cracked, frost and flame collided in a storm that shook the earth itself. Tom lunged for them, but the moment his foot crossed the threshold, the void swallowed him whole. He was gone in an instant, his scream cut short, leaving only silence. Sarah clutched Emily to her chest and staggered through the burning hallway. The flames recoiled at her daughter's presence but still licked at the walls, consuming the house piece by piece. Behind them, the cold room roared like a collapsing star, its doorway imploding inward, dragging the frost, the shadows, the whispers into its depths. And then, with a sound like the shattering of ice, it was gone. When Sarah stumbled out into the yard, the night sky above was torn between fire and ash. But as she held Emily close, the flames seemed to falter, curling back as if denied their prey. She collapsed into the frozen grass, weeping, rocking her daughter as the inferno raged on in the distance. She didn't know if they had truly escaped. She didn't know if the fire would spare them, or if the cold would return to claim Emily again. But she knew one thing, the room had been right about one thing. The fire wasn't done. It would come again. And the cold would always be waiting.